Hello, my name is Anniken and welcome to today's tutorial. Today we're going to talk about circular needles. Over the coming weeks I'm also going to review my favourite circular needle brands, but today we're going to talk specifically about circular needles, how to get started knitting with circular needles, how to use magic loop, 2 circular needles and travelling loop to knit on smaller circumferences with a longer circular needle. So keep watching and you might learn something new. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and please make sure you click the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. I try and post videos every Friday and it's a mixture of tutorials and Confessions of a Yarn Addict podcast episodes. So today we're going to talk about circular needles. I grew up in Norway and my mum has been using circular needles for as long as I can remember, so I started using circular needles probably as a teenager when I knitted my first sweater in the round. When I first moved here to the UK 30 years ago, circular needles were fairly unusual. I used to get comments when I used circular needles. People thought they were strange. 15 years ago when I started teaching, if I gave people a choice between circular needles and straight needles, most people would use straight needles. These days most people choose circular needles, and the ones that haven't tried them before still choose them because they want to have a go. But I do know that there's still a lot of hesitancy around circular needles. I know that because when I do shows and people look at my patterns and they see that a shawl pattern recommends a circular needle, they do ask about, oh, is this knit in the round? Can't I use straight needles? I normally recommend circular needles for shawl patterns because of the fact that you quite often end up with a lot of stitches towards the end, and it's just more comfortable on a longer circular needle than it is on a straight needle. So in this video I'm going to demystify circular needles for you. So if you still haven't bought your first circular needles and you're not sure about them, then do keep watching. And if you're an experienced circular needle knitter, tell me what do you use circular needles for. Do you use them for all your knitting? Do you just use them for things in the round? And tell me also what your favourite brands are. So I think one of the reasons why circular needles have become so much more popular is the increase in interchangeable needles. So interchangeable needles have become very, very popular, and there's a lot more different brands that do interchangeable needles now. So interchangeable needles are when you buy the needle tips and the cables separately and then you join them. We'll talk more about interchangeable needles later, and I'll show you what's inside my shall do case, and we'll also look at what you want to look at when it comes to choosing your first circular needles. So let's take a look at the pros and cons of circular needles, and in my opinion there are more pros than cons. I can only think of one con when it comes to circular needles. If you can think of more, let me know. But the first thing I want to say about circular needles, the first advantage of circular needles is that you can use them as straight needles. So you can knit in the round, but you can also knit back and forth. So most of the time when I use circular needles, I'm not knitting in the round, I'm just knitting back and forth. So I'm just treating them like straight needles. So I got some circular needles here, and when you knit with circular needles, all you need to think about is the needle tips. The fact that they happen to be attached doesn't matter. You just knit like you do with normal needles. You just treat the 2 needle tips as 2 separate needles. They just happen to be attached. And that is another pro as far as I'm concerned. Because they're attached, you can't lose one. So if I knit with straight needles, which I haven't done for years, I easily lose one. I drop it down the side of my sofa. If you're on public transport, you can drop it on the floor and then you've got to crawl around on that dirty floor to find it. If you're knitting in the car and you drop it down between the car seat and the gearbox, for example, or where your handbrake is, it can be difficult. Circular needles, you don't have that problem because they're attached. So if you drop it, you drop your whole knitting. So that is another pro of circular needles in my opinion. The other thing I like about circular needles is that if you knit a piece on straight needles, say it's the front or the back of a sweater, you knit from the left needle to the right needle. So to start with, all your weight is on one side, then as you knit, it transfers to the other side. So you tend to have the weight on one side or the other, and that can put a lot of pressure on your shoulders and your elbows. I actually have shoulder and neck, chronic shoulder and neck pain. So I've got to be very careful with how I sip and I knit and what needles I use and how I knit. And for me, having circular needles is much better. With circular needles, the weight tends to sit more central. So it tends to be more, even if it's a small piece or a big piece, it tends to be more central. You don't tend to have the weight on one side or the other. It all tends to be more central. And also because the needles are straight, you're not kind of like waving your arms around. When you're knitting with straight needles, it's easy to knock into somebody sitting next to you, or your arms move around, maybe not like that. You can also, if you sit in an armchair, you knock into the armrest and things like that. That doesn't happen with circular needles. You can sit quite easily with circular needles, with the circular needles just in your lap and knit, and you're not knocking into, it's just your, I don't normally sit with my hands like this, but it's just kind of your fingers that are moving. You don't have to move your whole arm. Now I probably don't flap my elbows when I knit on straight needles. It's been a long time since I've knitted on straight needles, but there is less movement with circular needles, and you are likely to get less pain in your wrist, in your elbow, and in your shoulder. So if you get any aches and pains when you knit, do consider circular needles. Do remember when you first start trying a new type of needle that the difference might cause problems, so give it a few weeks before you decide you don't like them. If you knit flat, you can fit a lot more stitches on a circular needle than you can on a straight needle. So this is an 80 centimeter long circular needle. Circular needle comes in different sizes from 23 centimeters up to 150 centimeters. So 9 inches to 60 inches and 23 centimeters to 150 centimeter. So there is a huge variety of needle sizes. I tend to mostly use between 60 centimeters and 100 centimeters. I don't really like using anything longer than 100 unless I have like 1,000 stitches maybe. But what I'm saying is that if you have a straight needle, the stitches fall off the end quite easily. With circular needles, when you're not knitting on it, you can just pull the stitches into the middle of the needle so your needle tips are empty, and then they're less likely to fall off the end of your needle tips. You can knit anything on a circular needle. You can do a scarf, you can do a shawl, you can do socks, you can do a hat, you can do mittens, you can do fingers, you can do just about anything. Well, you can knit anything on circular needles. You can do any circumference, you can do a flat in the round, absolutely everything. So if you invest in a set of circular needles, you don't really need your straight needles anymore. And I've actually replaced all my old straight needles and my old circular needles with a set of interchangeable needles. More on that later. Now, are there any cons to circular needles? To be honest, I can't think of very many cons. The only con I can think about is if you normally knit with straight needles and you tuck the needle in under your arm, or you wedge it into your body somehow, then you might struggle with circular needles, because circular needles obviously aren't long enough to do that. So with circular needles, you need to be able to knit with holding your hands not wedged against anything. So if you knit with a knitting belt, or you wedge the needle into your waist, or you knit with the needle under your arm, then circular needles aren't going to work for you, I'm afraid. Doesn't mean you can't use them for certain type of projects like socks and hats and things, but you probably don't want to use them for absolutely everything like I do. So let's talk about how you knit on circular needles. So you can knit flat. If you knit flat, it's just like knitting on normal needles. You just cast on and then you start knitting. You just treat the two needle tips as two separate needles. So you have the needle with the stitches in your left hand, and then your right needle is the empty one. You knit across, you turn, and you knit back, and you just knit back and forth. Let's look at a few things that you need to look at when you're buying your first circular needles. This is Chagu. You have to look at two sizes when you look at circular needles. It's the needle tip size, which is same as normal needles. So 4mm, for example, US 6, UK 9, whatever needle size range you use. These are ChowGoo, and they actually have the millimeter and the US sizes printed on them. It says they're ChowGoo 5 and then 3.75 in brackets. So 5 is the American size, 3.75 millimeter is the millimeter size. You can't, the old UK sizes, you can't buy needles in those sizes anymore. They've been officially phased out. I actually include the old English sizes in my patterns. So in my patterns, it will say 4 millimeter UK, whatever size it is, and then US, whatever size it is. But you can't buy needles in the old UK sizes anymore. All needles in the UK are sold in millimeter sizes now. But you might have old needles that you still want to use. So a few things to look at when you are looking at certain needles is you want to make sure it's got a smooth join from the cable to the needle tip. So you want to make sure that you can run your fingers along here and it doesn't catch on anything. This is Nipro's thing, and the Nipro cables, although I like them and I recommend them as a budget brand, if you run your finger across here for the join, they are not as smooth as the ChowGoo. There is a little bit of a catch here. I can catch my finger on it. It's not bad enough, I don't think, to catch a yarn on, but it's not as smooth as the ChowGoo. And the same thing for this Nipro. This is Nipro's thing. This is Nipro. I think these are called Smart Sticks. More about the different types of Nipro needles in my Nipro review in a few weeks. Again, I can catch it a little bit here. These are another brand called Higher, and they're fairly smooth as well. When I run my finger across there, it feels really smooth. And these are called Liquor, and these are interchangeable ones. And again, when I run my finger across here, they're really, really smooth. So I would say that out of the brands that I have here, ChowGoo, Higher, Nipro and Liquor, the only ones where my fingers catch slightly are the Nipro brand. The other thing you need to look at is the tip. And this is where it becomes a personal choice. What kind of needle tips do you like to knit with? These have a slightly shorter tapered end, so the end where it tapers to a point is slightly shorter, and they're a little bit more blunt compared to the ChowGoo. So these are the ChowGoos. ChowGoos have slightly longer tips, so the tapered end is a little bit longer. Don't know how easy it will be to see this, but if okay, so that's where the tapered ends start. So you can see the ChowGoos have a longer tapered end than the Liquor needles. Let's have a look at and they're longer than the Nipro, and let's compare, and they're tiny bit longer than the Higher. The other thing is the pointiness of the needles. So you can see these are ChowGoo, these bottom ones are Higher. They are similar in terms of pointiness. They're both quite pointy, whereas the Liquor needles are a little bit blunter. I do actually really like Liquor to nipper. They're really nice to nipper, but they're not as pointy as the ChowGoo. What about Nipro? I'm actually going to use some other Nipro ones that are slightly thicker. These are 2.75, so they're not, these are different sizes, but again, Nipro is not as pointy as the ChowGoo and the Higher. And it's not saying that the pointiest needles are the best, it's whatever you like. And it depends on what you're going to knit. A lot of general knitting, just knit and purl, colour work, cables. You don't need particular pointy needles, but if you're going to do lace, then quite often pointy needles are better because of all the decreases you'll be doing. These are bamboo ones. These are also ChowGoo, but they're spin needles. And these are not as pointy as the regular ChowGoo. They are blunter than the regular ChowGoo. I would say generally speaking, wooden needles, bamboo needles tend to be a little bit more blunt compared to metal needles. Metal needles tend to be a bit pointier, but that does vary from brand to brand. And I tend to use ChowGoo for most things. cables, colour work, lace, but I have lately been using the liquor for a few things. I haven't used these Chagu spin ones very much. I bought them to try them and I haven't really used them very much. And I used the Knit Pro fixed circular ones for socks, the 2.5mm. I use those for socks. And I do like the higher, but they're very, very light, but I don't use them a lot. And I'll tell you why when I do my review on them. So all these needle brands I'll do reviews on in the coming weeks. When you finish casting on, spread your stitches all the way around the needle. So I'm using a 40cm long needle here, so it's fairly short, and I don't really like knitting with a needle quite this short. I prefer to use a slightly longer needle and then either do the travelling loop or the magic loop technique. You need to have enough stitches so that it fills the whole needle. If your stitches don't come from one tip to the other, then you won't be able to knit in the round the way we normally do on a single circular needle. You then have to use the magic loop or the travelling loop technique. And even if your stitches do come all the way around, the first few rounds can sometimes be a little bit difficult as the stitches can feel a bit tight. This usually gets better the more knitting you've got on your needles. So if it feels a bit awkward, don't worry about it. Just use the travelling loop if you need to. If you knit back and forth on a straight needle, you normally have the needle with the working yarn in your left hand and then you knit with the empty needle in your right hand. Now if you do that with circular needles, then you'll be knitting back and forth. So if I knit into that stitch now, you can see it's not joining it into the round, it's not joining it into the circle. So we need to have the needle with the working yarn in the right hand and the needle with either the tail or nothing in the left hand. So depending on how you cast on, you may have the tail on that side and the working yarn on that side, or you may have the tail and the working yarn on the same side. It depends on which cast on method you use, so don't worry about that. But it's a working yarn that's important. The working yarn has to be in your right hand. And then you want to just spread the stitches around. All patterns that that are knitted in the round tend to say join to work in the round, being careful not to twist stitches. And it's kind of one of the most obvious comments ever, because if you're new to knitting in the round, it might not have occurred to you. And if you're an experienced knitter who's done knitting in the round a lot, then it sounds really obvious that of course you've got to be careful not to twist stitches. But it isn't obvious if you're new to circular knitting, and it is also something that's really easy to do. So it is really easy to twist your stitches on the first round, especially if you have a lot of stitches. So if you're casting on, say for example, 100 stitches, 200 stitches, 300 stitches, or even sometimes just like 50 stitches on a small needle can be difficult sometimes. But if you are worried about getting a twist, don't worry too much. If you discover it before you start round 2, you can untwist it quite easily. If you discover it after round 2, so say at the start of round 3, you might be able to untwist it, depending on how thick the yarn is. If it's after that, then you're going to have to rip back and start again. So if you're worried about it, or you keep making false starts, you keep starting and then getting a twist, just knit the first few rounds back and forth as rows instead. So instead of joining into the round, just knit back and forth a few rows and then join, because it's a lot easier to join in the round when you have a few rows on your needle. So just be aware that if you are working back and forth, you may have to change the first row because you'll be doing back and forth. So if it's garter stitch, for example, you can just knit every row. If you do garter stitch in a round, you have to knit one round, purl one round. If it's rib, depending on how the rib is, you may have to change it slightly so that you're doing the wrong side row of the rib for the first row and the right side row for the second row, and so on. Whatever you do, when you come to join in the round again, whether you join the round straight away or after a few rows, this is how you'll join. Now I've noticed here when I cast on, I've done something funny here. I'm not going to worry about that now because this is just a practice, but that's why it looks a little bit funny right here. It's at the start of my cast on and I don't have time to redo the cast on, so we'll just deal with that. So make sure your stitches go all the way around your needles, and then take a marker, stitch marker. So I prefer ring markers for this purpose, but you can use the padlock markers as well, Or if you don't have a marker, you can just take a length of yarn and make it into a loop and attach that to your needle. Back in the old days, like the 80s and 90s, we used to just use a safety pin fastened into the fabric. But you do need something to mark the beginning of the round. So the idea is that you want to join the end of the round, which is where the working yarn is, to the beginning, which is where you started casting on. So this is where I started casting on the left, and this is where I finished casting on the right. So I'm going to go to the first stitch, and I'm just going to knit this round just to make it easier. And I always tend to pull it a little bit tighter the first couple of stitches. Don't really need to when the stitches meet like this. You want to make sure there isn't a big gap when you join. So you don't want to have that last stitch all the way back there and then join, because then you get this big gap. You want to have the last stitch that you cast on here as close to the first stitch you're knitting as possible. So I'm going to knit. Now I don't like knitting with these few stitches on my needle, because, hang on, let me just make sure I'm not twisting this now. This is where I did something funny when I was casting on, so I'm just going to take those stitches off. If I was doing this on a real project, because I've ended up with a loop there, I would have to redo it, but this is just a practice, so I'm not going to redo it. I'm now going to just knit till I get to the end of the round. So I'm coming towards the end of the first round now. One thing to mention is that if your join between the needle and the cable isn't very smooth, your stitches might get a bit caught when you try and move them from the cable onto the needle tip. That can especially be a problem on the first round if your cast on is a bit too tight, or if your needles have a very uneven join. So if you struggle with that, usually if you just use your fingertips and just ease them across and a little bit of force, obviously being careful you don't break your needles. So if you've got wooden ones, be a bit careful. Usually it's not a problem, but sometimes you do have to be a little bit forceful. So I'm coming to the end of the round here, so I just want to check as I approach my marker that my stitches are not twisted. Okay, so there we are. So my stitches are actually, I have actually got a slight twist here. So that strand there shouldn't be, it's over the needle. So if I knit that strand, let me take that marker off. Can you see that that strand has somehow ended up over my needle? So if I knit that strand now, I'll end up with an extra stitch. So if that happens, or if your stitches are twisted, you can just untwist them, and I can just take that strand off like that. I know I have a bit of a gap there now, but if I carry on knitting, so when you get to the marker will be on the left needle, you just flick it across to the right needle. Make sure you don't drop it, and don't put your knitting down when you got the marker at the beginning of the needle, because it will fall off. So now I can start knitting again, and I quite often, when I get to this point, will just double check that my stitches aren't twisted. And I've actually noticed I have actually got a twist in mine. There we go. I think I actually did that when I came to the beginning of the round just now. So let's just go back and untwist that. It is so easy to twist the stitches before you start your first round, or you can also twist it on the first round. So let's just have a look here. I'm going to just follow the cast on edge all the way around, and can you see here it twirls around my needle. So if I just go like that, twist it around, don't worry about that working yarn, we can just thread that through. There we go. Now I can see that my stitches are not twisted, and then carry on knitting. So that's the basic knitting in the round, which is fairly easy. So next, let's look at the traveling loop. So I'm going to show you the traveling loop on this project, which is a pattern in progress, a new design in progress. And I'm actually on the last round. When I get to that marker, I can actually cast off. I do actually have enough stitches on these needles to fit all the way around, but I only have slightly more stitches than the length of my needle. So there have been times on this project that it's felt a little bit tight. I like to be able to push loads of stitches up my needle like that. So if we imagine that this fits around just like that, or my needle is also maybe a little bit too long for the number of stitches I have, but I have too many stitches to comfortably do magic loop. So what I do then is the traveling loops. The way you do the traveling loop, and I tend to do the traveling loop and I can't push my stitches, enough stitches up on the left hand needle. I like to have stitches pushed up, right up, so they just jump off as I knit them. But if it feels a little bit tight and you're struggling to fit it around, then traveling loop is a good idea. So with traveling loop, you just take the right hand needle, so the needle with the working yarn is coming from the needle in my right hand. I take that right hand needle and I pull it enough so I pull out a loop. So with the magic loop you have 2 loops, with the traveling loop you just have 1 loop. So there's no loop on the other side, it's just that 1 loop, and then I start knitting. So I just got to make sure that the last stitch I knitted and the next stitch I knitted are next to each other. They just got this loop between them, which is fine. So let's just knit a little bit here. How many stitches I do depends on how many stitches I got in total and how tight my needles feel. So once I've done a bit of knitting, I can just pull that one around and carry on. So every time the knitting feels a bit tight and it feels like it's not feeding up on my left hand needle enough, so sometimes that might just be like 5 or 10 stitches, sometimes it might be 50, but when that happens I just pull that needle out and I'm ready to go again. It's fairly quick. You can do this as well in situations where you would normally do magic loop. If you don't like magic loop, this traveling loop is a perfectly good option. You do have to make sure that you have a marker to mark the beginning of your round, because it will constantly change. So on magic loop, quite often you will have the beginning of the round where you change needles. Well, if you keep changing that point, you need to know where the beginning of your round is, so you need to have a marker. This is my current sock in progress. I'm going to use this to show you how to do the magic loop. So I do actually have a whole tutorial on the magic loop. It's a little bit too much to include in this video, make this video very, very long. So if you've never done magic loop and you want a full tutorial on magic loop, then I will link to that tutorial below, because I show you how to get started with the magic loop, how to set up your needles, how to change your needles around, and all that kind of stuff. Here I'm just going to give you a very brief overview over what magic loop is. So magic loop, you have half the stitches on one side and half the stitches on the other side. And you normally divide your stitches in half. If you have a particular stitch pattern, which makes sense to divide the stitches differently, that's absolutely fine. So if I had a pattern repeat of say 5 stitches, and I might want to arrange it so I had 30 stitches on one side and 20 on the other, for example, or if I had knit 2, purl 2, rib, I usually like to start every needle with the knit 2 if I'm doing a rib. So I would then start with the knit 2, finish with a purl 2 and do the same on the other side, which may mean that I end up with 2 more stitches on one side than the other. Whatever you do, it doesn't really matter. It's normal for the beginning of the round to be where your needles change. So this is where I change my needles, and that's the beginning of my round. So even though that's at the top of the sock and I'm now down on the foot, I can still tell where the beginning of the round is, because I know that it's where I changed the needle. So I know that that's the beginning of the round and not that side. If you move the needles around, then you have to remember that you need to put a marker on. So the way this works is that you will put half your stitches on a needle tip in your left hand, and the other half of the stitches will be held at the cable at the back. Then you'll have a loop at this side, and then you pull that needle out, ready to start knitting with, and you'll have a loop that side. And the idea is that these loops either side are roughly the right length, so you don't want to have a really small loop on one side and a really massive one on the other side, because it just makes it a little bit uncomfortable. For socks, I find that 80 centimeter long needles are ideal. You can use 60 centimeter, but I find 80 centimeter more comfortable. For other things, I would say the same for sleeves. I would probably use an 80 centimeter long needle. For hats, I've started using a 60 centimeter and then gone down to magic loop as I decrease. This depends on what you're knitting and what you're comfortable with. So to start knitting now, the working yarn is coming from the back. So the working yarn always comes from the last stitch you knitted. You should never be knitting into the stitch that the working yarn is coming out of when you start, when you're knitting the round. So if I had, let me just change these over. If I had those stitches on my needle and I was ready to knit into there, that would be wrong. I'd then be going backwards, which is a problem. And a very common mistake when you're new to knitting in the round. So the working yarn is coming from the back, and that doesn't matter whether you knit English style or continental style. One thing you've got to be a little bit careful if you knit English style is that the working yarn goes the shortest distance from the last stitch you knitted and the next stitch you're going to knit. Make sure you don't accidentally somehow wrap it around the cable. So can you see here that the working yarn is going around my cable? If you do that, you will get a ladder on each side. So if you're getting big ladders on the sides where you join, where you change needles, do check to make sure that your working yarn is going the shortest distance from one stitch to the next, and that you aren't looping it around here. Sometimes it can just be that you're knitting a bit loosely, especially the first few stitches. It's easy when you knit English style for your, depending on how you knit, to like relax the tension a little bit on the needle as you throw the yarn, and that can create slightly loose sides. Having said that, continental knitters also get ladders sometimes. Couple of tricks to tighten up your ladders is to knit the first couple of stitches a little bit tighter, not too tight so you can't move them on the needle, but a little bit tighter. Alternatively, you can alter where the beginning of your round is. So once you start knitting, I'm going to just quickly knit across here. So as I come to the end of that needle, stitches are now on my right hand needle and my left hand needle is empty. So I'm going to flick my knitting over, and then I'm going to pull the empty needle, going to pull these stitches that are on the cable onto my empty needle tip. Like that. So these are the stitches I'm going to knit next. That's where the working yarn is. So I know those are the stitches I just knitted. So I'm going to pull those onto the cable. So I just pull the needle tip. Careful when you first do this, when you're pulling the needles, make sure you don't pull it the wrong way. So keep an eye on it. And if you find that you're going to pull it through the stitches and they're going to be in free fall, then stop. So I'm going to grab that needle, pull it forward and around so I can knit with it. Common mistake is to try and knit with it from here, which you can't do, or just to like pull it not far enough around. So just pull it in far enough around so you can knit with it, and then also make sure you've got a little bit of a loop either side. And if you find that this is twisting around, that is a common problem with a lot of needle brands. And one way of dealing with that, if your cables are too kinky, and that can be a problem with magic loop especially, can be annoying. These aren't too bad actually, but if they are very kinky, get your steam iron and get someone to help you if you can. If you haven't got anyone to help you, straighten your needles down, so hold them on a surface, and then put a book over either end or something heavy over either end, or get someone to hold the needle tips, and then take your steam iron and don't touch it, but just go as close to the needles as you can without touching it, and just press the steam button a bit, and that usually straightens them out. But be careful you don't touch the cables, because that will melt them, and that would not be a good idea. So I'm now ready to start knitting again. So I'm just going to knit across here. And then I'm going to show you what to do if you get ladders. If you get ladders, and this is a good tip for both magic loop and for double pointed needles, because they both can be easy to get ladders. Normally, if you get ladders down here, it tends to get better with practice. But it is annoying. So one thing that you can do, so this is the beginning of my round, because that's where my tail is, all the way down the bottom there. So now instead of, I'm going to set up my needles ready to start the next round. And then I'm going to actually put a marker on there. Now normally I wouldn't bother having a marker if my beginning of the round is at the side here, because the marker will just slide around this cable, and every time I come around to the end of here, that tends to fall off. So it is quite annoying because it easily falls off when you change needles. I've got the marker on there, and then I'm going to knit 2 stitches. So I tend to do 2 if it's just plain stocking stitch. If it was a stitch pattern, say it was a knit 2, purl 2 rib, I would do knit 2, purl 2, and then do what I'm going to do next. If I had a pattern repeat, say 6 stitches, I would do the whole pattern repeat, because it makes sense to start each needle at the start of a new pattern repeat. It's just easier to keep track of. And if you're doing a rib, I always like to start with the knit stitch. So if it's a knit 2, purl 2, I always start each needle with a knit 2. If it's knit 1, purl 1, I start with a knit 1. So I'm going to do 2 stitches, and then I'm going to grab that right needle with the 2 stitches and pull it. Keep pulling it. And do you see what happens? Those 2 stitches popped around to the other side. So you can see I got the mark here where the beginning of the round is, and then I got those 2 stitches. And then you can just carry on knitting. And then you do the same on the other side. So get to the other side, I'm going to change my needles over. And then I'm going to do it again. I don't need a marker there because I got a marker to mark the beginning of the round, so I don't need a marker here. But I'm going to knit 2, grab that needle, pull it, till the stitches pop around the other side, and then carry on knitting. So that's how I do it if I get ladders. You can also try pulling the yarn a little bit tighter on the first 2 stitches. But that can sometimes cause problems with your tension or make the stitches too tight. So this is a good alternative, because you're constantly changing where the beginning of the round is. So you can do 1 round and then do every time you start a new needle, you knit a couple of stitches and move them around, or you can do it every other round, whatever. Probably easier to keep track of if you do it every time you change needles. If you want to move those stitches back, by the way, so I've got to that marker. I take that marker off. If I want to move those stitches back to the other side where they belong, all I need to do is stop before I get to those stitches, don't knit them, and then pull that needle, and then they're back to where we started. I'll have to do the same when I get around here as well to move the other 2 back. So as long as it doesn't matter where the beginning of your round is, as long as you have a marker and you know where it is. Also, while we're talking about markers, if you don't like having a marker, ring marker like that on your needle, or you don't have ring markers, you just have these padlock markers, you can use these. You can put these on the needle like that, or you can actually put them into the fabric. So that's the beginning of my round. I can put that in there. It's like we used to do in the old days with safety pins, and then knit a few rounds. The more rounds you do, the more difficult it is to see exactly where that marker is supposed to be. So you have to move it up every few rounds and be quite careful to move it up. But that's what we used to do before we had fancy ring markers. Another alternative to magic loop is the 2 circular method. So in this method, you'll be knitting a small circumference, so socks, mittens, sleeves, top of a hat, anything that's too small to fit on a big circular needle. And instead of using 1 circular needle and the magic loop, you're going to use 2 circular needles. So you'll have half the stitches on 1 circular needle. So I put it on this red one, and then you put the other half on the other circular, on another circular needle. So I'm using this green one. I've chosen 2 needles of different colours. They're the same make. They're both Knit Pro, but these the red one is the Knit Pro Zing, and these, I think these are called Smart Sticks, but they're the same size. They're both 2.5mm, and they're the same materials. They're both metal. Got to be a bit careful about mixing materials if you do, say, 1 needle metal and 1 needle bamboo or something like that, because sometimes your knitting may end up slightly different tension on different types of needles. So whether you're knitting metal or wooden, bamboo, Carbon fibre, it may affect your tension. So try and use 2 needles from the same make if you can. I do think there is a good idea sometimes to choose needles that look slightly different, and you'll see why. So this is ideal because they're the same make and they're made from the same material, but they are different colors. So I'm gonna knit these stitches first. So I'll push my stitches onto the needle tip, ready to knit. What I want to do is I want to knit with the other end of that circular needle. So that's the needle that my stitches are on. I want to grab the other end of that circular needle and then knit with that. This is, to be honest, I don't really like this way of knitting because there are just too many needles involved. I find it very clumsy. I used to teach this method in my stock classes where I taught magic loop. I would teach this as an alternative. I'd show everyone the 2 methods and then let everyone choose what they wanted to do. And I just, over time, decided that magic loop was better. But there are some people who like this method, and if you don't get on with magic loop, this is worth a try. So I've now finished knitting these stitches. So I drop that green needle. I pull the stitches onto the cable. Then I take the stitches on the red needle. This is where I don't like it. I just get really tangled. Maybe an idea if you use this method to use shorter needles. Instead of having 2 80cm long needles, you could use 2 60cm long needles. That might make it easier. So now push the stitches onto the red needle because they're the ones I'm going to knit next. And then I grab the other end of the red needle. So you don't want to grab the green needle, you want to do the other end of the needle you're knitting with. And this is where this can become a little bit confusing, because if you have the same needle, it's easier just to grab the nearest tip, which would be that one, and then you end up with all the stitches on one needle. So I've now knit across with this red needle. So the stitches on the red needle would always stay on the red needle. The stitches on the green needle would always stay on the green needle. The only time I would say this might be a good idea would be if you needed a different tension on one side. So if you want to knit one side on one needle size and the other side on another needle size, then this might work. I can't think of any situation where you'd want to do that though. But it's worth a try. I'm not a fan, but just because I don't like it doesn't mean that you should not like it. Other people might like it. If you've tried this method and you like it, let me know. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was useful. Tell me whether you like circular needles, whether you've never tried circular needles. If you've tried them and didn't like them, tell me, and tell me what your favorite brand of circular needles are. And in the future, in the next few weeks, I'm going to do some reviews on my favorite circular needle brands, and I will post the links to those videos as they become available. I'll try and remember to add all the links to that below. So if you watch this video at some point in the future, you can just look below this video and see all the links. And I will also link to all the other review videos on each video, if I remember. There's a lot to remember. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and do consider subscribing, and do click the notifications bell so you don't miss any future videos. Thank you very much for watching.